Welcome to the Backus Nurses Wage Analysis, put on by the Backus Federation of Nurses Bargaining Committee and AFT Connecticut at our most recent bargaining session in September of 2011. We requested this information about each nurse from the hospital to help us put together a contract that makes sense. This included years of service and rates of pay for every single nurse so that we could take a comprehensive look and so that our bargaining committee, our negotiating team, could make a proposal that made sense. To make a proposal on wages, the first question you have to answer is, what are the wages for RNs at the Backus Hospital? It's not an easy answer because there's so many answers. The lowest wage is $27.40 an hour. The highest wage is $50 an hour for a nurse in the resource pool. The average wage is $38.55 per hour. This is the average of every single nurse's salary. So if we take every nurse and add up what they make per hour and divide it by how many nurses there are, the average would be $38.55. But $38.55 and $27.40 and $50 doesn't give you a real understanding of how much nurses make at Backus Hospital. There are 446 nurses that work at the hospital. The most common rate of pay, the pay that appears most often, is $42.35, and we'll get back to the mode and what it means in a little bit. But first we want to talk about the median wage. There's 181 different rates of pay at the hospital. So for the 446 nurses, there's 181 different rates of pay. The one that sits right in the middle is $41.77. So if you were to take the wages, which started around $27.31, and lay them down in a line all the way up to $50 an hour for a nurse in the resource pool, the wage that's at number 91, the one right in the middle, would be $41.77. But we really want to know what determines the rate of pay. We want to know what is the objective criteria that would make a difference between making $32.45 or $44.27. I mean, why do people make different amounts? So we figured the best thing to look at was years of service, because even under a current pay-for-performance system, it makes sense that the longer you work there, the more you make. This is a graph of how it actually looks at the hospital. Each blue dot here represents a single nurse. So if you have 20 years of service and you make $32 an hour, you're going to find yourself on this graph. In fact, a nurse that has worked at the hospital for 20 years is currently making $40.76 an hour. That's a nurse that works there right now. At the same time, a nurse hired less than a year ago is making $45.68. So we didn't feel like that gave us, when you look at it as a scatter, a really clear understanding of what people make year to year. So what we did was we took each nurse that has been there for a year and total up all of their hourly wages and divide it by how many nurses there were. And we did that for each year as we went along. And what we found was a line that looks like this. So when you take all of the nurses that have been there for less than a year and add up all of their salaries and divide by how many of them there are, you get $35.50. So the average nurse who's worked at the hospital for 3 years makes $37.72. The average nurse who's worked at the hospital for 7 years makes $36.02. So we talked about the most common wage. This would be considered the mode. It's the number that appears the most often out of those 181 different wages. In the hospital, the most common wage for a nurse is $42.35. So we took two different years and tried to compare them. So when you look at RNs with 2 years of service, you can see there's 31 of them. When you look at RNs who've been there at the hospital for 12 years, you can see there's 12 of them. The lowest wage for an RN with 2 years of service is $27.46, while the highest wage is $50 an hour in the float pool. The lowest wage for an RN with 12 years of service is $32.51, while the highest wage for RNs with 12 years of service is $42.56. But when we look at the most common wage for a nurse with 2 years at Backus Hospital is $42.56. And the most common wage for a nurse with 12 years at the hospital is $42.46, just a 10-cent difference. So again, we're looking at the most common wage between nurses who've worked at the hospital for 2 years or nurses who've worked at the hospital for 12 years. And we can see most often that there's only a 10-cent difference in their pay. It brings us back to this question of what determines an RN's rate of pay. So we thought maybe it's more closely tied to your years as an RN, and we were able to looking back, and look at when you were issued your license. So we downloaded all of the licensure dates for Backus nurses and put them again on a scatter plot. And we can see that the scatter plot doesn't look all that much different from the one that was based on years of service. A nurse with 4 years as a nurse is making $38.44. And a nurse with 10 years as a nurse is making $37.46. Now these are Connecticut licensure dates, so there are some discrepancies and we would expect some outliers. But you can see that we're not talking about a few outliers here and a few outliers there. What we really see here is a very widespread fracture of salaries and wages based on years as an RN. Again, we took each nurse and created an average rate of pay based on how long they've been a nurse in Connecticut. And what we found was that the average wage for a nurse who's had a license for either 3 or 5 years is $34.35. The number actually comes out to be exactly the same. And the average wage for a brand new nurse is $34.83, almost 50 cents more per hour than the average wage for a nurse who's had a license for 3 or 5 years. Which brings us back to the question, what determines an RN's rate of pay? At the very beginning of negotiations, the hospital's lead attorney made an opening statement. And as part of his opening statement, he said, "Unfortunately, we live in a society where pay is not based on the importance of the work you do or the value it adds to our society." He said, for instance, firemen and teachers make far less than bankers and lawyers. He said, in our society, pay is market driven. And Backus cannot agree to a pay scale that would make the hospital uncompetitive. Because pay must be market driven. That's what our society dictates, he said. So where does Backus Hospital fit in as compared to the other hospitals in the area? Windham Hospital and Lawrence Memorial Hospital are the obvious choices, so we took a look at their average salaries. The first one we want to look at is Windham Hospital. Windham Hospital has a pay scale, which means that every nurse who's been there for 5 years makes the exact same amount depending on their clinical ladder. Let's talk about the clinical ladder. At Windham, they decided that what they wanted to have was a system where a nurse could apply every single year to be placed on a ladder appropriate to their skills. So they make an application and a panel of nurses and managers reviews the applications and determines if they have a skill set that qualifies them for a higher clinical step. Most nurses at Windham find themselves on clinical step 2, which is represented by this brown line. And as you can see, Clinical step 1 starts out at about just over $30. I think it's $31. And clinical step 3 tops out at over $51 an hour. Most nurses, again, find themselves on clinical step 2. It's difficult to get to clinical step 3. You have to be highly skilled. But the skill level to get to clinical step 2 is what they want to see people, almost every nurse, be at. At Lawrence Memorial Hospital in New London, they have a very similar setup, but they only have 2 different rates of pay. Clinical step 1, which they call LNM staff RN, and clinical step 3, which they call clinical step 3. Most nurses at LNM find themselves on the lower line, the purple line, the staff RN line. It's very difficult to achieve the clinical step 3, and that's something that they continue to work on as a team with management, but that they designed to be that way. So what we did was we took the 2 averages because we didn't know which one made more sense for the hospital, but we put them together so that we could look at them as a composite. And you can see here there's the blue line is the average pay based on your licensure date, and the red line is your average pay based on years of service at Backus Hospital. When you take these 2 averages and lay them on top of the average rates of pay at Wyndham, you can see that the Backus average pays are lower than they are at Wyndham after about 6 years. They stay together at the beginning. As you move on through the steps, the Wyndham nurses most of them following this brown line, continue upward while the RNs at Backus flatten out. When you add in Lawrence and Memorial, you see a very similar trend. So what would the union do? What is our recommendation to fix it? Our negotiating committee looked at these 2 contracts and other contracts across the state and came up with a proposal that would be a step system for wages. And when we look at our proposal, and we can get a little bit closer here, you can see that what we're doing is creating a step system. Each nurse at the hospital would be placed onto a step that is not less than they currently make. So if you're a nurse and you make $30.10 an hour, you would be placed on step 3 and your pay would be advanced to $30.80 an hour. Because you're higher than step 2, which is $29.10, but lower than step 3. Our proposal is that there is a general wage increase for August 2011, a general wage increase for August 2012, and a general wage increase for August 2013 of 3% each. And those dates and numbers could be moved based on negotiations, but just so you have an understanding of what our initial proposal is. So if you found yourself on step 3, come August of 2011, which has already passed, you would be making $33.48. The following year and following your anniversary date, you would move over a step and down a step to $36.28. So the following August, you would move to $34.48, and on your anniversary date, you would move to $36.28. And again over to $39.23 in 2013. Also, we wanted to give back a bonus for maintaining certified status in the field that you work. So if you're an oncology nurse, that you are certified in oncology. So if you were on step 3 and you had your certification, you would automatically move to step 4, which is $32.50. We also made a proposal that at the top, there are 2 steps for resource nurses. We, as of yet, do not have a proposal on what requirements you would need to become a resource nurse. So looking back at the rates of pay over years of service as it currently works, what the proposal of the negotiating team would do is flatten out our system just like this. And we'd have a system that looks more like the Wyndham and L&M hospitals. So the next obvious question is, how does it fit into the market? When we take our proposal and lay it on top of the Wyndham and Lawrence and Memorial Hospital wages, you can see our proposal is the red and blue line, and it actually starts out lower than all of the other hospitals, but gradually increases and stays right within the lines. The only 2 wages that are higher than the other 2 hospitals are the 2 that exist for the resource pool nurses. The other question that we have to address is how people move from step to step. Currently, there's a pay for performance wage and salary system. And we tried to break down the pay for performance system into 3 bullets. And what we got were that nurses and managers would create goals for each nurse every year. And at the end of the year, there's an evaluation to determine if the nurse has met her goals. And that nurses can then earn a percentage of a raise by meeting their goals. We revised the pay for performance model to look like this. And you can read through it. It's a number of different pieces of contract language. But to break it down, what it says is that every nurse will have an evaluation every year, that it'll happen on the Sunday nearest to the anniversary date. And this is the crux of it. The evaluation will be based on nursing skills only. There'll be objective goals that are clear and understood by the nurse and the manager and that everyone is agreed on. The review must be evidence-based, which means that if there's anecdotal evidence, it must be in writing, and the nurse must have an ability to respond to that anecdotal evidence. And that really what we're looking at is things that you clearly can or cannot do. If a nurse is found to be unsatisfactory, meaning they haven't made their goals for the year, they will not receive their anniversary step bonus. They'd still receive the general wage increase, but they wouldn't receive their step bonus. But the nurse and the manager would sit down and put together a plan that gets the nurse back on track, that sets out the objectives that they need to meet and the timeline that they need to meet those things to get their step increase. But at the end of the day, if you think the evaluation was done wrong or done unfairly, you have the right to grieve it, to bring it to a neutral party and say, these are the things that I don't agree with. If you're still found to be unsatisfactory, you still have the ability to go back and work through that plan and try to meet the goals that you need to meet to get to your step increase. We think that this brings a much more fair and clear system to the pay for performance model. It allows the hospital to evaluate nurses and make sure that people are meeting the skills that they need to meet on a yearly basis. But it also lets nurses be in the driver's seat about what's going on, and their pay is so important that we want to make sure that ultimately, if we disagree, there's an ability to grieve, an ability to bring it to a neutral party. And that's the wage analysis. If you have any questions, we're happy to talk them over. We did notice some outliers in terms of salaried RNs, in terms of graduation dates, in terms of nurses who have out-of-state licenses. When we parse all that data, we find very few anomalies that make much difference on the overall averages that we talked about today. So we don't think that they play a large role. As we get more data, we'll be happy to update things. And if you have any questions, we're happy to address them. You can talk to anyone on the bargaining committee. You can come to negotiations, or you can give us a call. Thank you very much.